different sides of the fence, but
Same objective.
got along well.
Absolutely.
Okay, it's just after 11 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. Good morning. Thank you for attending. My name is Chris Pant. I'm the Director of Public Works. Up in front of you, we have at the far side, Derek Sari. He's our Assistant Director. And then at the table also we have Rich and Janelle. They are from Woodard and Curran, which is the consultant we've been using to help us with this project. So this morning we're here to talk about a stormwater utility and what is being proposed at the March town meeting. So we're going to start off with just a few minutes of orientation and give you some context, and then we'll stop and we'll hopefully have some discussion and answer some questions and take it from there. So here's how we'll cover our brief presentation. We'll just summarize how we got to where we are today. Then Rich will get into the program evaluation that was done, talk about the options that we have. We'll summarize, and then we'll talk about next steps. So I think it's generally understood across the country we have challenges with our infrastructure broadly, and stormwater has been rated as a D in terms of grades by the American Society of Civil Engineers. That's not necessarily reflective of Westboro specifically, but I think it's important to understand that this is not unique, that what we're talking about today is not unique to Westboro. These are conversations taking place in lots of different places around the country. Typically, the infrastructure we're talking about, stormwater infrastructure, is intended to last 50 to 60 years. We have infrastructure here in town that averages around 50 years old, some that's definitely a lot older, and certainly some that's newer and less old. The broad point for the discussion today is to bring awareness and talk about challenges, and then ultimately provide some recommendations on how we move forward. So how we got to today, back in at least 2020, but I know some discussion happened previously. There was discussion about how we were going to fund stormwater infrastructure, and there was discussion about looking at it, setting up an enterprise fund. And in order to do that, you need to do some intent analysis and homework, and that costs money. So about a year and a half ago, we were able to get a grant from the state, and part of that grant covered hiring a consultant to help us look at this issue and provide recommendations on how to move forward. And so today is kind of the culmination of that effort. And so we're presenting to you what we've discussed, what we've looked at, what we discussed with the select board and the finance committee, and brought us to today, and then what we're proposing for the March town meeting. So I'm going to kick off with just a brief overview of our assets and kind of what we're talking about. And what's depicted on this slide is this is a snapshot of assets in our town. And so these yellow dots and these yellow lines represent stormwater infrastructure in our town. And this is one street. It's about a dozen houses up there represented. It's a cul-de-sac, but there's a lot of stuff there. There's about 30 structures and then lots of pipe. And so these structures here, these rectangles, are what are called catch basins. That's where the water flows into. It's treated, and then it goes into a pipe, and it's conveyed along a pipe to some location where it's discharged. And so the water collects in these catch basins. It travels along these pipes. These circles are what you see as manholes in the street. That's where you can access the pipe to clean it and take debris out and what have you. It flows along these pipes, and goes to a discharge point where that water then flows over land or some other way to, in this case, it goes to what's called a detention basin, so that's man-made. It's a location where water consolidates, and it goes there for a couple reasons. One is to treat it, to try and get some of the sediment out before it discharges into the wetlands or wherever it's going. And it's also a form of flood control because it helps us control the amount of water that's being conveyed somewhere in a potentially a rapid manner, right? So the point of this slide is just to show that what we're talking about today from an operations perspective is all of this infrastructure. And this is one street in the town. This red dot up here this is obviously Westboro. This red dot is representative of this street. So multiply this street by all the streets in Westboro and you've got kind of a big number of things to take care of. And so what our staff does this is routine work for us. We go out to these sites and clean them, inspect them, make sure they're functioning the way they're supposed to. So that's the operations piece of what we're talking about. The second part of it is more of the capital aspect. So bigger costs associated with replacing things. So this previous slide was talking about maintenance and going out and doing routine things to just keep things running the way they're supposed to. But at some point you have to replace those structures because they get old and they deteriorate and they don't function the way they're supposed to. So shown here are two examples of efforts we've completed. So on the left, you've got the town-wide culvert assessment. So that was done this last summer, where we looked at all of our culverts across the town and identified their condition and then put them on a plan that says how we should replace them over time. So we looked at 155. There's actually over 200. 48 of them were submerged, which means we couldn't inspect them at the time of the assessment. But many of them are beyond their useful life, which means they need to be replaced at some point. So that dollar figure, 3.4 million, is an estimate of what it would take if all we did is took out the current pipe and put a new pipe in. That doesn't account for any sort of like adding or making better the situation. It's just purely one-for-one replacement, which isn't always the case, but that gives us a start point for conversation in terms of number. So that $3.5 million is what it would take to fix the top 20 on our list. And remember, there's 155, and not all of them are 100 years old. You know, some are newer, but time ticks by, and if we did one a year, it takes us 20 years to fix those 20 culverts, right? So part of the discussion is how do we handle things in a sustainable fashion, in a long-term, consistent way, not just for this year or for next year, but for the next several decades. On the right side of the slide is a different study that was done several years ago to look at corrugated metal pipe. So I'll flip back real quick. So again, these yellow lines here represent pipe, and in many cases, that's corrugated metal pipe. And so this study looked at about 25,000 feet of pipe across the town with a camera and checked the condition of the pipe. And so about 25% of that or so was deemed in a condition that needs to be repaired or replaced. And so that cost, we're looking close to $3 million to do that. And for perspective, you know, we looked at about 25,000 feet. We have over 300,000 feet of pipe in the town. So this number is merely just a piece of the pie. It's not the end state. That's not going to solve our problems. This is just, again, highlighting the fact that there's these costs out there, and we need to figure out how we're going to pay for them and how we want to pay for them sustainably over time. So that was intended to just give you an idea of what the requirement, what the need is. And what we're going to talk about now, Rich is going to come up here and go through a few slides and talk about a potential way we could fund this requirement as a town. What do you?
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. Pleasure to be here. So Chris spoke to some of those needs based upon real data that's been collected, and what we do as consultants is help guide the process to understand how you build a program to meet those needs. Look at the projected cost over time, and we're really looking at how we view our funding strategy for stormwater. So when we look at funding strategies, most utilities look at capital, operations, some kind of buckets, as we'll call them. I call them program buckets. So we did this analysis with DPW and other town staff and said, okay, well, what does your program really look like based on those needs? And what is in addition to that? So when you start spending more capital to do these projects, you need more engineering support. You need more inspection support, so it takes up staff resources. So you have to look at the bigger picture. So we're looking at building a program to support those needs in a more sustainable manner, and it's not reactive. At the same time, it's a new program. So we understand that there is a capacity in which the town can't jump out the gate and just do 10 projects at once. So we need to start to build capacity with the program. We typically look at a few-year planning horizon and say, well, what is the average need across that? Knowing that there's some things that are going to fluctuate. We'll have a little bit more engineering effort 1 year, and then we're into construction on a few projects, and then the cycle kind of repeats itself. We also have compliance obligations that the town has a permit with EPA. We need to continually maintain compliance. That's another important element of the program. So we looked at a few years and said, well, these are reasonable numbers. And we also talked about things like, well, what's the service? What do people get for this? And a lot of the program is focused on capital needs that Chris presented that show that we do have immediate projects based on infrastructure life. And this is, again, common in many communities. We know enough that we have a backlog that says we've got to start to get a program to chip away at that and not be reactive. The other advantage to that is with all good planning, you have the opportunity to leverage resources along the way. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So we looked at the program. We said, well, the first few years, 1.5 million is a good starting point. And that includes engineering, capital expenditure, construction of projects. And how we spend that money is part of the funding strategy. So it's not just all that goes to one project 1 year. So we can bond, we can look at other financial strategies too. But we need a consistent revenue in order to do those things. So that's really what we're talking about. And how do we get that revenue? Well, the standard business is tax increase. And there's challenges with that, with competing interests in the general fund. And that has to be looked at every year. And so we can't dedicate and plan properly for utilities like stormwater. And so this is why we have enterprise funds or enterprise accounts and user fees for water and sewer, because we need to maintain that level of service. So we need revenue that we can rely upon to respond and plan properly to fix things or maintain operations and a level of service along the way. And some things just can't be compromised. So the two primary mechanisms that most people turn to fund their program are tax increase or some other standard practice that the town has used for capital, bonding, et cetera, or stormwater utility. And so the stormwater utility has several advantages that are listed here. The biggest being it's stable. We can plan for it. And it's a program that we've crafted to meet our needs as best as we can understand them in the near future. And we can refine that over time so it's flexible. So there's 1 year where all of a sudden we have to spend a little more on capital. We can accelerate that part of the program. Or we're going to spend a bunch of money designing things to then have a nice bid package to get economy of scale with construction projects. So there's that flexibility because it's a dedicated account that the money can come from, and we can use it in a variety of ways. Many people see a stormwater utility as more equitable. And I'll get into the rationale on the next slide, but it seems more fair to people. And versus assessing the need for stormwater based on property value, which is our traditional approach for taxes. The other advantage is unique is the town is subject to what we call Water Management Act permitting, which is for drinking water withdrawal. So having a utility in place has other benefits to the community in terms of water resource management and having those dedicated funds. State agencies like communities to implement utilities to have dedicated revenue for stormwater. So that's another key advantage that I don't have here on this slide, but you can really start to leverage outside funding and take advantage of that because you've got seed money, essentially. So when we look at the fundamental approach for a stormwater utility, we have to think of, well, what's driving the cost for stormwater? Runoff from properties, developed and even undeveloped properties contribute runoff and flow to streams and water systems. And we have, Chris alluded to control of flow and water quality. We also want to promote groundwater recharge for drinking water resource management. And we have a lot of sensitive environmental areas, ACECs, areas of critical environmental concern within Westboro. Some beautiful resources that we want to maintain. So when we think of what drives the need for stormwater, well, it's really development. And impervious cover is the best way to measure development and the amount of runoff that leaves a site. Some of that is captured and treated, some of it is not. A lot of the older systems, simply the traditional approach for decades was get it to the closest stream, get it out of the way. And for people who do road design, water on roads is the enemy. So it was, the traditional approach was to get it away. And so when we look at what drives the need to do the maintenance and management of stormwater for operations and replacement of that infrastructure, it's largely runoff due to impervious surface. So we look at a rate-based approach to say, well, your property is contributing more runoff. Therefore, there should be a proportionate fee for service to address and mitigate those impacts. And so this is a measurement tool like you would say for a water meter for water and sewer, where we're trying to find a way to approximate what your use of the system is that the town has to pay for. And it's not perfect, but this is a metric and an approach that's been used overwhelmingly across the nation for thousands of utilities. And I would say it's the core methodology for 80 to 90% of utilities across the country. So when we look at the parcels within Westboro, we look at properties and we say, okay, well, what do those look like, developed properties? And single family makes up the largest count, total number of parcels. But when you look on the right, they have a much less amount of impervious area. So we want to look at the characteristics of the community and say, well, how do we come up with an equitable approach for people to pay their share? So we have to understand property type, we have to understand the impervious area, and then that informs us on our methodology for how we might fund the program in that rate structure. Just like you have a billing rate structure for water and sewer, we have a basic methodology, impervious cover, and then we talk about, well, what part does someone pay based on their property type and the size of that property? So we did an intense data analysis, and this is a challenging slide to digest. But the point is we look very closely at all properties. And so this histogram is showing distribution of single-family residential impervious area. So this is your rooftop, this is your driveway, sidewalk, pool patio, it's stuff that produces runoff, and that's the metric that we're using initially to evaluate what we think might be a reasonable rate structure. And because single-family properties are the majority of the total properties, we start there because they also look similar at first glance. When you look at the data closer, you see, well, there's a lot that fall in the middle, and we call, the median is about 4,200 square feet of impervious area. So that's not, again, it's not the square foot of your home or your parcel, it's the impervious area on that property. So a lot of them fall around that range, but then you see, well, we've got some really small and really big ones. So does it seem fair to charge everybody the same rate? So we start to look at rate methodology for residential, and some communities choose to go one for all. Others decide, well, we'd like to make it a little more fair because, grandma in her little home shouldn't pay the same as a McMansion with a tennis court. And so there's that equitable consideration. Rate methodologies can also become very complex. And at some point, it sort of defrays the argument because you're slicing and dicing in really small increments. So we went through this evaluation with the town, and we presented this to Select Board and the Advisory Finance Committee. And we felt that a tiered approach made a lot of sense. It kind of recognized the difference between property types and sizes, but didn't make it too complicated either. And this is very similar to a lot of other utilities in the area. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So we kind of put them into buckets, and we call those tiers. And then we apply costs associated with those tiers. And this is another data-heavy slide, but it's showing the numbers and how they shake out. Total parcels, and these are the tiers of each residential category. And then what is the revenue needed based on that $1.5 million revenue, program revenue? What's the fee once you kind of do the math and divide into the total number of properties in each category? and that's how we come up with fees. It's a fairly simple calculation, but then we have to look at all other properties. And so I mentioned that the non-residential properties have the majority of the impervious area. Those are businesses and everything that's not single-family residential. So because they have a large share of the impervious area, they pay a large share of the total cost. And that's because they're contributing the most runoff. Now within that, there's opportunity for credits. So really large properties that are managing their own stormwater could qualify for a credit because you want to recognize that they are doing something at their own expense, or they invested in stormwater management so that they shouldn't have to pay their full fee. So there is an opportunity to sort of get credit or abate a portion of the fee. But this is just to illustrate, hopefully a little more simply, the rate methodology for single-family residential. So when we think small, medium, large, this is kind of what we're looking at. And again, these are very preliminary numbers. We think we have a reasonable program cost, and the data so far, which is still subject to change in further rate study, the data so far shows these approximate numbers. I know I've got it down to the penny, but that's just because we can calculate as far as we want. But generally speaking, this is the annual fee for small, medium, large homes using a tiered rate methodology for single-family residential. And then all other properties pay a multiple of that first tier. So if you've got 10,000 square feet, you're going to divide that by 2,000, so that's 5 units times the rate. So there's, I don't have examples of each individual property, but we can easily do that. We have the data. So that was part of what we came up with what seemed to be a reasonable rate methodology. And it's very similar to other communities in the area. There's about 24 utilities in place in Massachusetts, and half of those have been implemented in the last 5 years. So it's more communities are recognizing that this is a really good way to fund their program and to have a more sustainable, financially sustainable and proactive approach. Some of these communities, like Franklin, I worked with Franklin to implement their utility. I've worked in probably 36 communities in Massachusetts. I have seen the rate methodologies evolve over time, where now we have better data, better information, and people feel more comfortable understanding some of these things. And this is why we're here, to help the community understand. But what we've crafted for you guys is similar to what other communities have seen for need and a starting point in their program. So similar revenue, Franklin's about 1.6 million in revenue, Shrewsbury's 1.7, and the fees vary, somewhere in the range of $50 to $100 per year. Some of them are more. City of Northampton has fees for residential that are much higher. But it's not an apples to apples comparison. So you got to be careful that we're not just comparing our number to our neighbor, but we're in the same range. So it's similar. It's not out of this world, and it's a good starting point. So I just wanted to recap a few things from the study, the work that we have done leading to this point, and feedback from town staff and other meetings that we've had. And again, this information is on the website. You can review the meetings and recordings and presentations are all on there. These were some of the takeaways in terms of, if we have an understanding that we have a need, we recognize that, okay, this size program seems appropriate for now. So there was general agreement on that, and that a stormwater utility makes sense versus a tax increase. So this is why we'd like to pursue implementation of that. There's general support for a tiered rate structure, and this is what has informed the articles that you see before you that'll be presented at town meeting. And so, as Chris mentioned, it costs money to set this up. So there is some professional support that the town needs. But it largely comes down to the town, understanding it and making an informed decision. We help guide that process, and at some point there are things with data and billing that we need to set up, mechanical stuff. So there's a need to have money to implement this program, and that's one warrant article. And then the other is to actually establish the account where the money would go and authorize this program. Now, there's a lot of things that need to happen along the way, so this doesn't mean you get a bill tomorrow or next month or even this year. It could be longer. And I'll speak to that in just a moment. But so that was the biggest thing. I think a lot of people, the feedback at some of these other meetings was, well, I don't understand the process. And so that's, you know, if you have questions, we'll answer that, but I'll hopefully address it a little more with this slide. So in terms of next steps, I mentioned the warrant articles. The draft bylaw, I believe, is on the website at the moment. And, you know, it's a bylaw. There's some stuff in there that is a little heavy. But it's generally in line with every other utility in the state. There's certain things that need to be said in there from a legal perspective. And there's other things that we can address in more detail later. So the point is you have to agree that this is what we want to do, and we start that process, and we allocate funding to do so. And there's a lot of details that we worked out through that implementation, and these sub-bullets here that you see, you know, there is a continued public engagement process. There is a update to data. So we're going to refine the data, and things where there's errors, we clean those up. We do an updated financial analysis. So those rates that you saw will probably change. They're going to be refined, and we can shift things a little bit based upon where we see things that are maybe unfair or disproportionately burdened on other or certain types of properties. With that comes a final rate setting, and there's a process for that similar to the other utilities in town. And so along the way, there's kind of a check and balance, and there's policies that need to be implemented just so we document our process and decision-making. So when there are questions in the future, like how often does my bill get updated or my impervious area get updated, we just need to establish things like that. So it's part of kind of programmatic administrative work. And then ultimately, we got to create a billing file so we can send out. So these are the mechanics of implementation. And the approximate time frame for programs like this, because we have to allocate funding, we can't start the work until third quarter of this year, if it were to pass at town meeting. And then by the time we do the work, have the engagement process and final votes to implement the fee, and bills go out, we estimate somewhere in the first half of 2024. So there is a process to this that we want people to feel comfortable with. So that's hopefully brief enough, although it's been half an hour or more. Appreciate your patience, and wanted to just make sure you guys are aware of the resources, and that, you know, there's another meeting this evening that will also do the same thing at. These are recorded. For questions, I think we need to have people come up to the microphone so that the audience at home can hear, even though you can probably speak loud enough for me to hear. So with that, I guess we'll turn to questions unless there's any other comments. So, is it like drinking from a fire hose, or? Yeah, feel free to stand up if you want to, or pass the microphone around. Do you want me to?
So how would residents access the like GIS data to, you know, I'm sure there'll be questions like, how do you verify my impervious area? Like, so is that part of a data file, like we have our GIS file accessible? Would they call DPW to ask that question? That's the first question. The second question is, I think you mentioned there's an abatement process or a corrective process on the commercial side. I didn't hear the same on the residential.
Yes. Yeah. So what we've done, and again, you know, this is part of next steps that we would refine, but in a lot of communities, they've chosen to set up a website that pulls the same data that the town has available now, and it shows impervious cover with an aerial image on your property, and we can calculate the billing units. We have all the data right now. It's just there is some refinement to that we would need to do to fine tune the numbers, but that's more work to come. So there's a level of investment that we had with the project to get to this point, and based upon the decisions that are made and policies, you know, that data does need to be updated to some extent. So if we choose to build down to the square foot, we're always going to be wrong because the data is just not good enough. You know, we don't have it, and the expense to get that data is just not worth the value. So we try to put things into buckets. So we just need to be close enough And I know that, until you see it, it's hard to understand, but we can provide those as part of that process, or at least examples. So we'll have to work that out with the town, but I think that's important to hear. The second question you had, sorry, remind me.
Yeah, let me jump in too, just so specifically to the question about how someone would see their own property. Right now, you can go to the town's website. On the main page, there's I forget what it's titled, but basically you can click on a button that's a map for the town, and you can show the imagery of the town, and there's a tool on there that allows you to calculate the area of your rooftop if you wanted to. So you could on your own at your house right now, today, figure out a ballpark of what your impervious area is for your residence or whatever property you want. But many towns, specifically related to stormwater utility, have the ability to go to a specific website that's a little more clean in terms of its purpose. And so you would, as a customer, you would be able to go to that website and without filtering things, just go directly to the site and figure out your impervious area using an online tool that's basically imagery and zooming and measuring.
And I think the second part I did remember was the abatement, I think you asked?
So just to clarify, though, impervious area is not just rooftop, right? It's solid, it's paved surfaces.
Correct.
It's paver surface, like decks, that sort of thing, right?
Yes. Okay. So if you went to the town website today and zoomed into your property, and you can see it on the imagery, but you also obviously know where your property is. You could measure the area of your roof, and I mean, I'm not saying you would do this. You just use the little cursor, draw a square. It tells you it's 500 square feet. Do that for your driveway. Do that for your patio. Add those together, and that's your impervious area generally.
Understood. The second question was sort of any sort of abatement process. I'm not sure I'm using the right word, but I think you mentioned there is for commercial, but I presume there's a similar process if there's some sort of correction that's needed and determined. Thanks.
Yeah, certainly, yeah. Very good question. So credits are different than abatements, which are different than adjustments. So adjustments means we think the data is just wrong, and we need to make a refinement to the data, which it can happen. One of the benefits of putting things into chunks, or buckets of impervious areas is as long as you fall in that range, we can update something along your driveway that didn't get picked up like a small walkway. But if it doesn't make enough difference in the data to put you into the next category or bump you down a category, then there's no need to update it. So it helps us deal with data refinement processes that would quite honestly consume too many resources and cost. But so there's an adjustment opportunity. If you think your bill's wrong, there's a process that's spelled out in the bylaw that you can have it adjusted, reviewed and adjusted, and the DPW will respond to that. Abatements are its own category. You're saying, or really more, there's also exemptions. Sorry, I'll start with exemptions. These properties are exempt. They are not going to be charged. That's spelled out in the bylaw. So the town exempts roads. We don't charge for our own roads. Otherwise, we'd have to pull money out of the general fund just to pay for that. Right? So there's certain things like that don't apply. And so, but in terms of credits, now residential credits, you're looking at, roughly the majority of properties will be in the $100 range, roughly, right? 115 or maybe they're as low as 60. So we don't want to give credits away for nothing. So people have to earn credits by doing things that decrease the town's cost of service. So if you continue to give money away, then you don't meet your revenue need, and somebody else has to make up the difference in the rate. So we want to be careful, but we also want to encourage good behavior. If people want to invest in their property, for residential, it's generally just not enough money to be a worthwhile investment, to be honest. And that's why we see many communities set up credits for what they call small properties. So you have to have certain metrics that you meet. We don't need you to hire an engineer necessarily, but you need to prove somehow that you've done something on your property that benefits stormwater. Larger properties are receiving a larger bill. It's more worthwhile from a business standpoint to invest in a credit opportunity. And sometimes if they've built it recently, they probably qualify already. but we also have to set boundaries on what we provide credit for. And that process is usually handled outside of the bylaw because it's very nuanced and people have a lot of feelings about it. And, you know, we have to have a lot of discussion about, well, how much credit and for what? How generous does the town want to be? I've seen communities offer 100% credit. That if you do all these things, which are almost impossible, then you can get 100% credit. So it's available. But very few communities, or sorry, users in all utilities actually exercise that option. So usually we see like anywhere from a 3 to maybe 5% impact on the revenue because people see credits. You're not going to find 1,000 people coming out day one asking for credit because we have to structure that program effectively. So it actually provides real benefit. But it is important. And from a legal perspective, we do want to have the opportunity to abate your impact. Now, there's also, in terms of abatement, there is consideration for low-income or fixed-income elderly population, following similar metrics for tax abatement or tax discount. So that is something that we've tried to speak to in the bylaw, that policy would have to be worked out, but we want to acknowledge that that is a concern, and that is not unusual to do that with this program. So does that help, I think? Okay.
I just want to add on. So the bylaw specifically allows for abatements, exemptions, and credits. What those are is to be determined. And that's the part of the implementation process where we collectively have discussion, decide what we're going to agree to. Ultimately, the select board, per the bylaw, would approve whatever's decided, but that's how we come to that point. But as Rich said, all those things have second order effects. So if we give credits, exemptions, whatever to this side of the room, then this side of the room has to pay more because we have to make up that balance if we're trying to get to a certain amount of revenue. All that has to be figured out. So it was summarized, and maybe there'll be more questions about it, but this town meeting, there are 2 articles. One article is the proposal for a bylaw, and that bylaw just says the town making a commitment that we think this is the right road to go down to fund a stormwater utility. How much you pay, what the rate is, what credits, what exemptions, what abatements, all of that is figured out as part of the implementation. As was mentioned, there's the public aspect, and then there's ultimately forums where decisions are made, and then things are published, and then we implement. But you're not signing up for a $60 bill at the town meeting, because that's not decided yet. We're committing as a town to say, you know what, we think we might want to pursue this as an approach to funding our stormwater structures. And we've proposed that, okay, it probably makes sense to do that in about a year. Like it'll take us about a year or so to implement. But if for whatever reason it was decided it's going to take 2 years, or we want to take 18 months, or whatever that timeline is, the town meeting bylaw just says we can do this if we choose to. There's no, you're not signing up for anything other than a commitment to pursue. And the reason we are suggesting that is because the pursuit part, the follow-on activity, costs money. And so, at least from my perspective, it doesn't make sense to spend all that money, get to the end, take a vote on it, and we say we don't want to do it. Well, then we just, in my view, we wasted a lot of money. So let's commit up front if we want to, knowing there's still work to be done. And then we get to the end, decisions are made, and implement when it's appropriate.
Yeah.
Little off the question there, but add on.
Yeah, just to add real quick onto that. So, you know, yes, things are yet to be figured out, but we're trying to set a reasonable expectation right now to say we think the program is in the range of 1.5 million. That's a key factor. We think based on that, with certain rate structures, here's the range of cost for certain properties. Now, we can't come back and say it's going to be double. It doesn't make any sense. We know enough about this. This is why you hire people like us, that we know how this goes from start to finish. And so we can manage those things, and that's part of the further analysis, but it is an investment. And we also want to make sure that we have public engagement and buy-in at some level along the way. So this is the beginning of that process, and there's more to be done. So I understand there's something in front of you that is a heavy subject to vote upon, but it also is a process that we need to begin. And we've done enough analysis with the grant study that we've done, which was fortunate that the town got a grant to do this. And they've invested a lot of time to come up with, within that funding, what do we think is going to work? Knowing that we're gonna have to revisit a lot of these things and just make sure, is that 1.5 million right for the first 3 years? Or should we look at a little bit more because we'd like to, I mean, I've had communities say, we'd like to accelerate our program. Why aren't we spending more? Because I felt the impact of flooding, or I don't want roads to close because culverts are deteriorated. And they said, well, we feel like we're financially sound that we could do that. That happens occasionally. We don't want to chop it down to the point where we're back to square one. So we're trying to make, craft a program that is going to support the town's needs in the future, knowing that we do have a backlog of immediate needs too.
So I know I'm kind of reiterating what Rich is saying and kind of repeating, but there's a lot to this, and so sometimes it helps just to hear it again. So we showed the slide with the houses that shows small, medium, large, and we put a number up there. This one, yeah. So those numbers, the 57, the 115, the 172, as Rich said, that's not 100%, it's going to be $57, but we also recognize it can't be $200, right? Because we put this up here because we think that's about where we're going to be. If it's 62 or 53, could be, but it's not. We're not going to come back and say it's 102 because that doesn't really make sense, and that's not in line with what we've suggested our requirement is.
Yeah, please, if you could step up to the mic.
We will change it though if you say to make it higher. So
We could get more done if you choose to fund at a higher level. Feel free to adjust it, yeah.
A couple of questions. I guess first, is the concept just like our water bill? We would get a quarterly bill for the enterprise fund for sewer? I realize it doesn't sound like you have the mechanism in place, but is that the concept?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so certainly can make adjustment, but I think our initial thinking is that it would actually come in the mail just like with your water and sewer bill. So you'd get your water, sewer, stormwater bill all in one package, and there you go.
All right. Second is, I don't remember when the law was passed, but I know that on newer houses, roof drainage has to be infiltrated. Would that be the kind of thing that an abatement or a credit would come in for a single-family home, for example? Is that the concept, or an idea how that would work?
So that would be an example of something an owner, property owner, in this case, maybe a residential owner, did to manage stormwater.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that would actually qualify for a credit, but that is an example of something that someone did to help manage their stormwater, yes.
Yeah, I realize you're not committing to something like that, but it's one of the concept. This is for just maintaining current infrastructure. It's not going to talk about improvement to infrastructure. The reason I'm saying, for example, on my street, all the storm drains go to concrete pipe. That concrete pipe discharges directly to a stream. Would there be an idea going forward that in some areas you say, okay, we're going to need a detention basin before you discharge to a surface water? Would that be something that this would cover, or is it just maintenance of things as it stands right now?
So I think that broadly, I think yes. Like if it's stormwater associated, we want to fund it out of this program. But it could be that, I know you're saying a specific built-up location, but maybe there's maybe a redeveloped location that would be part of that project cost separate. But your street specifically, if for some reason it was decided there needed additional structure, then part of the analysis going into repairing or resetting that street would include, hey, do we need to redo this? And so that would be factored into that would come out of this as far as I can see.
Yeah, because I'm thinking like the MS4 program, you have to do sampling. Well, part of that is going to be looking at sampling to look at where impacts are. Am I getting the concept right that sampling might lead to remediation, for example, improvement, or is it just tracking back? We got methyl bad stuff coming from somewhere, and now we have to go backtrack where it is. I'm just trying to understand when something like that would kick in.
Yeah, no, so you're speaking my language when you say MS4.
I'm sorry?
You're speaking my language when you say MS4.
Yeah.
And these types of issues. So this is why we look at it as a program. I know we presented a lot of the top priorities, really just to show some of the urgent needs that have dollars assigned to them. We've studied those, and we know that those are high-risk concerns, and those are high priorities. Mm-hmm. We need to balance priorities. But those things are very much part of the program considerations when we look at what are the other things that we need to do for stormwater. So the permit does require things like evaluation of water quality issues. We do have in the detailed analysis of the program that we did, that's the backup to that 1.5, how we spend that capital, there's flexibility. We can access funding sources for low interest bonds and other programs that the state offers too. And we can manage priorities across those. So it just may not be the immediate list of priorities, but we do need to consider water quality, like water quality for Lake Chauncey. We recently completed a study on nutrients and nutrient management issues related to that. That is going to require improvement to existing systems that discharge to the lake at some point. But we need to manage community priorities as well. So, but those things are, there are regulatory drivers that compel the town to start to try to implement projects in those areas. And we've done initial studies, and so that planning level of effort is coming into focus. And these are things that we'll continue to refine with priorities and capital planning, which will be reviewed on probably at least every year. We have to do that for the MS4 permit anyway to look at your obligations to comply anyway. So hopefully that helps.
Yes.
It's just, it's a matter of priorities and how much we can kind of bite off at once. Mm-hmm. But the nice thing is with a well-established program with funding like this, we can get money for water quality that we may not be able to access as easily for just a culvert replacement. The town is currently leveraging grants for ecological restoration for culverts right now. That was part of what we did with this study as well. So there's lots of opportunities to do that, but hopefully that helps you see that.
I just want to add, and just kind of a different way of describing it, and you're nodding your head, but just for anybody else that's kind of still wrapping their head around it, it's no different than water or sewer. So if you're a participant in the town's water supply, like if you pay for the town water, we come sometimes with projects that are repairs. But we also, even recently, have come to town for funding that comes out of the Water Enterprise Fund to pay for additions to our system to make it better. So we're going to build a couple of chlorine booster stations. Those are new structures added to the system to help it run better that are funded out of the Water Enterprise Fund, so people that pay for water. So it'd be similar to that for stormwater. So if people pay into that, we fix things, yes, but there's also, for whatever reason, down the road, a requirement for something new. We add it in, we pay for it out of this fund.
Just to clarify, I'm not expecting a detention basin at the end of my street. It's just an example. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
So you're looking for $1.5 million the first year, I guess, and then theoretically it's $1.5 million every year?
Yes, we try to look at an average period.
Okay.
And so that we're not just changing
that's
rates.
okay. That's okay. And so the initial grant, how much was that for?
For this
That you
project.
applied for from the state to get the process started?
So for this project, it was about 100,000.
Yep.
The total project.
It's like 100,000?
Yeah.
Okay. And so on the first year for the 1.5 million, what would your cut be, Woodard and Curran? And what would the DPW's cut be in that 1.5 million as far as setting up the infrastructure of the billing system, the clerical work, this kind of stuff?
So-
Usual and customary because you've done this numerous times, right?
So we have two town meeting articles that I mentioned. One is the bylaw, and the second one is the implementation. That comes with a cost. It's $150,000. So that $150,000 is what would be used as part of the implementation and part of the work that Woodard and Kern does with us. That part is funded from that article. Once the enterprise fund is established and we're generating this 1.5 million, there's no cut, there's no continuous fee that we're paying anybody else other than programmed, budgeted contracts for work, and that can be
Well,
for anything.
if you set up a few people that are collecting it and managing it, accounting for it or whatever,
Right.
if you just use the town resources of the finance department or
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
assessors.
Which is what we're doing, or what we will do.
So it's a one-time setup cost, to answer your question, yeah.
So you're in it and then you're out?
Yeah, we do this to help communities find ways to get access money. Once we set up the program, sometimes we come in to maybe do a rate study further down the road, but it's not a.
That's at our request. It's not,
Yeah.
we're not signing up for any, we don't have any commitment beyond the implementation
This is-
to anybody.
Yeah, so it's non-proprietary. This is not, anything we do is public information. Everything you see here is public. You know, we're basically guides to help you guide you through the process. And I've seen communities do it on their own. You know, New London, Connecticut was the first utility in Connecticut in 2018. I helped them behind the scenes, and they wanted to do 90% of it themselves. I said, that's great. I will help you where you need it, and we want you to be successful so that you can get the work done that you need. And then thereafter, largely, it's capital expenditure for construction. That's really what the funding is all about. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do the property taxes now pay for? I mean, are they supposed to pay for this?
Yeah, so we have a DPW budget.
And you go to town meeting, you put a warrant, or you put an article on the warrant for things that you do. And so why not, instead of doing this, why not ask for the 1.5 million from the town at the meeting?
Yep, that's certainly an option. And
Well, it seemed like it would,
at the end
it would stop all the accounting and the extra bill that people pay, because people are already paying for this, theoretically, right, with their property taxes?
you're paying for something. You're not paying $1.5 million right now to do stormwater. You're paying taxes that are allocated, apportioned
everybody.
to all kinds of different things.
Right.
So the DPW gets an amount that's approved at town meeting to fund all kinds of things. And what this is addressing is a shortfall in funding that, like, we don't have the money to do, we don't have this 1.5 million now. We're saying we need to be
But
generating
the
that.
shortfall is because you're not asking for it at town meeting.
That certainly is an option for us to come to town meeting and ask for the budget to be increased by whatever amount, 1.5.
Or
And
for a special project like the school committee comes to try to do something, or the library trustees try to do a library
Right.
expansion or whatever.
so, but I think the point that we're trying to make, and I'm not advocating, at the end of the day, my responsibility is to maintain the infrastructure for the town, and how we pay for it. It's important to me from a professional standpoint and as a member of the town staff, but at the end of the day, where the dollar comes from, it doesn't matter. it obviously matters to the community as to how you're paying for things. And so establishing this fund provides some equity for people that pay for it. It provides predictability.
What is the equity thing about? I mean, everybody's paying property taxes right now. We already got equity, I think. You know, I see you guys marketing it as equity, but I'm not really catching. Equity is a big word these days, certainly.
Well, so
We can answer.
equity is subjective, so let's all agree that, yeah, some people think things are fair and that they can agree or disagree on those things. So when we look at a stormwater utility, we're looking at a fundamental shift in the funding mechanism. What is driving the cost? So we don't pay for water and sewer on the basis of property value. When you look at stormwater, you can have a really high value property like a hotel that has a relatively small footprint in proportion to its value. So on a tax basis, they're going to pay a lot for that stormwater piece of the pie in Chris's budget. Now, they're not generating as much runoff though, but a property that's a large parking lot that isn't valued as high is going to pay, they're going to contribute more runoff, but they would normally not pay their fair share through taxes. So when we look at how the cost is being driven, and again, it's not perfect. It's not a perfect system, but we approximate based upon, cause and effect of what's driving that cost. So when we look at, and I can dissect.
It's okay. Yeah. I get the equity marketing ploy here. So the other thing is the idea is the town doesn't have enough money from the regular budget, the regular property taxes. So we need to create another funding vehicle for DPW. It's kind of the thing.
Well, we're creating dedicated funding, so it's not fluctuating and unpredictable. And
well, the property taxes are the revenue stream into the town from property taxes is a dependable stream kind of thing like that. But I'm wondering,
it is with the exception of priorities, because Chris has to compete against schools, fire, police, and just I do this for a living, and I know stormwater just doesn't get the attention. It doesn't scream loud enough, because when it's sunny out, it works perfectly fine.
well, I understand, but
so
we
it's that
could do this. We could do this. We could do this across the board. We could have a dedicated school fund, a dedicated town hall fund, a dedicated library fund, and this kind of business like that. One of the things I'm concerned with is the other things that DPW is spending money on. So I understand that there's a push for the electrification of their vehicles. And so I noticed, which is also in the school system, say a school bus costs $150,000, the electric one costs $300,000, $400,000. So I'm sure it's the same kind of breakdown for the DPW office. And so if you're along those lines, maybe you're spending $1.5 million on electrifying your vehicles when we could, that could fund this thing instead of going after the net zero Westboro. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
well, just so we're clear, since there's other people listening, we work off the priorities of the town, and if the town chooses to pursue electrification, then we would certainly do that. We're not spending money on electrification now. We're certainly looking at it because that's what the town has asked us to do through published plans, but it wouldn't be accurate to say that we're spending money now. You said electrification specifically. I want to be clear that that's not happening. You kind of made it sound like we're siphoning money off, and that's not accurate. But at the end of the day, you all approve our budget. You see it line by line. It's published, and you can certainly look at that and see where we're spending our money. And I'm happy to talk to you about it anytime. But it's published. So.
Yeah, and so this is where this is why we have these engagements, is to have a healthy discussion about need, and if we know that there's need that's unmet and it's been challenging to fund historically, we know there's benefit to investing in this, and we need to keep things up and address problems that plague the community, and people maybe haven't had a forum and a program to really focus that on. So this kind of brings things into focus and looks at it from a program standpoint, because stormwater lives in lots of places in every community. Planning deals with it a little bit with site plan applications. These guys have to maintain it. They're the recipient of things that are built that maybe weren't built properly years ago. And it's a very challenging program. So we're trying to have a more cohesive program concept. And I've said this before, like, you know, people ask me, well, what's your measure of success with stormwater utility projects? And it's like, well, it's not whether you implement the fee and that fee's this XYZ rate structure. It's whether you fund your program at all appropriately. And people recognizing that there's a need and there's a benefit to the dollar I'm spending, and this seems like a more reasonable approach, not perfect, and we can dissect fairness and taxes and everything else all day long. The one thing that we've seen with our experience is that these programs get more attention. You're not reactive because you don't have to go to town meeting to make that capital request because things fall apart, which is why water and sewer have dedicated accounts, because interruption of service for those utilities is really not acceptable. And there's a big risk to the community, so you need to have the money available in some reserve capacity all the time and get to a proactive standpoint. Utility Enterprise Fund allows you to do that, and there's a lot of advantages to leveraging that money for more grant. So we do this all the time with communities and say, well, you need to be looking 18 months down the road for alternative funding sources, so we can take this 1.5 and get you 2 or 3. And it's very impactful from a finance strategy standpoint, so there's that to consider too. And again, I don't have a horse in the race no matter how you do it. But if you're looking to get your program to a more sustainable level, this is a mechanism that a lot of communities have turned to for a variety of reasons and benefits. So, but again, this is why we want to talk through that. So, I think it's 1204. I haven't seen any comments from the
No, I
online.
haven't either.
Okay.
So.
We've been at it for an hour. We'll certainly can stay a little bit longer if there's more questions, but, oh, yep, sure.
Try to be very quick.
Sure.
I don't even think my questions really have an answer. It's more of a, I think this is what might make people more comfortable.
Could you come closer to the
Sorry.
mic?
So I'm standing here as a person in a tier 1 home that feels silly because I'm like, I should be happy about that. But I know how much stormwater generates off of my teeny tiny property from where I am at the golf course, and then it's the town forest. And then my backyard is literally a straight downhill. We have so many like rocks, boulders, sleet. The water's not being filtrated the way, you know, you want it to be, and that kind of, and then it runs off into the street. So I'm certainly not here being like, put me in tier 3. But at the same point, if we're not going to change this, I know as someone in this tier 1 that might be paying less, I know there's so much more that I could do, and I know that was already spoken about with Shelby. Are there ways to support homeowners for future? You know what I mean? I understand this is infrastructure for future, and you haven't gotten there yet. For me to feel more, I guess, let me go back to what I'm hearing. So right now, the main priority is the current infrastructure. It definitely needs replaced. It's not the best. So I guess my question to that is it still the best infrastructure? Or, you know, so are we replacing it, but it's still not the best? Or is there other better ways? Of course, I looked into like the green infrastructure. Are there more of those kind of projects that, again, I'm hearing could be in the future? But if we're focusing on repairing what we have now, if it's not the best choice to repair, should we be repairing it? So those were just kind of like, again, I don't really expect answers. I'm just kind of
they're great comments.
throwing them out. So yeah, so it's like, I'm questioning the existing infrastructure.
Right.
What else did I want? And then, you know, back to like, what can homeowners do? And I think being a homeowner that's like, ooh, I could do rain gardens? That sounds like so much fun. You know what I'm saying? That is, I think, hearing more about, again, we're not expecting a full-out plan, because like you said, that's going to take time. That's why you have this team. But if there was just a little bit more guts to it, I think people might jump for it a lot more. And I understand not wanting to take it to town meeting, especially waiting for, like, here's an emergency, then what happens? So I guess my other question was, if it was at town meeting, my first question would be, what would happen if we said nay? So back to this, when this is presented at town meeting, what's going to happen if we say nay? What's the alternatives? Again, that might motivate people to jump on board or to take hike. And then I like the public engagement opportunities. Again, we like to be an active. Money, of course, we understand, but if we kind of feel more involved in it, that might make it easier. And then, I think that was it. That's all.
Well, thank you for your thoughtful comments. Chris, I can take a few of these. I'd love to. So what I'm hearing is you'd like to see tangible benefits. And so you're going to pay a fee. You want to know what that's doing and the impact that's having in a positive way in the community. So that makes a lot of sense. And so I've done this in many studies where we look at what we call willingness to pay. You know, what are you willing to pay for a certain type of service, knowing that you're going to get a benefit from that? And is it $5 a month? Is it $10 a month? And if you ask the people up here, I'll be like, 50. I'll pay 50 because I know stormwater and I know the need, but that's different. Everybody has a different feeling for that. So helping people understand the tangible benefits that come with a program like this is important.
Yeah, Lake Chauncey, you should talk more about Lake Chauncey and how the biology and stuff.
And so what we try to speak to today was that there is a very significant challenge for every community across the country with this program. We're trying to get started, and as planners and scientists and engineers, we know how to solve these things, but there's a financial gap in the ability for these guys to implement those programs. So I think, I mean, it's kind of laughable sometimes, like, okay, this is like, I spend more on coffee in a month than this fee, but people, new fees, new financial programs, it's challenging because not everybody's in the same position. My electric bill was $700 last month. I would have loved to have spent that on stormwater. I've got 3 teenagers, so, okay. And I almost choked, and it's like, wow, I would love to see that spent in other ways, but that's just the cost of doing business, and we need to be a little more conservative. So, but there's a benefit to that program. I'm gonna pay that no matter what. If we're gonna pay the fee, well, you have an opportunity to provide input on that program. And if the town agrees that, well, we'd like to have a mix of projects that are addressing green infrastructure needs, that's great. There's a lot of things that work really well the way they are, they're just old. So looking at new opportunities, like when we do culvert replacement projects, and Derek can speak to this very well, a lot of culverts weren't sized properly because they were built for the development at that time. So when we look at those, we're not just replacing it because it's damaged, we're enlarging it. And sometimes it gets to the point of a bridge. It also allows for ecological restoration, for flow and critters and fish to swim through it better. So there are benefits to replacement projects of what we traditionally call gray infrastructure. And so that type of example, I think, is definitely, that is a key objective of or benefit rather, of the culvert replacement program. Green
Fixing, but you're also better.
Correct, because we have to meet stream crossing standards and other environmental permit requirements as well. And we want to make sure it has adequate flood capacity, things like that. So, but there is a part of the program that is trying to look at recharge projects to recharge groundwater. It's a great way to treat stormwater and remove nutrients and other things that would benefit things like water quality, like the impacts you see at Lake Chauncey. So it's a matter of weaving those together and managing priorities. But hearing from the public what they'd like to see in this program is important because we've crafted a program that we think gets you started in the right direction, but that input process is key. Anything you want to add, or Janelle, or anybody? We can talk all day, so. Hopefully that answers some of your, or responds to some of your comments.
Yeah, like I said, I just feel bad because, I mean, I'm sure, I mean, I understand, I mean, just what that guy said, a lot of these newer houses, probably in the tier 3 homes, are probably, with all the things that they've installed, because they do, newer, they're probably producing less stormwater than like my little shitty house that is not.
Well, and so to speak to the rate structure, this is not set in stone. This is a one approach, and we can look at, shifting those things based upon, we have to use some rationale to say, well, there's a real thing, real data that supports this. We can't be arbitrary in how we charge people. But so there's some underlying rational nexus between your impact and the cost for that service. But there's a variety of approaches we can take to make it more fair. And again, that's something that has not been finalized. These are just preliminary. So you kind of know what to expect to some degree, because we want you to understand and vote and have an informed decision about advancing this concept, knowing that those things, that what you just said, we can work on that and refine it.
So let's just say it gets approved, and with this hope, and like you said, investment, this is our town, and down the line, you've done all your work, and now will you come back to the community and say, this is what we've done, and this is what we're gonna do? And then does the community have a chance to go, oh, that's not what we expected, and we don't, or is it, like, is this vote, like, final? Like, and then, my worried money. Yeah, I'm always thinking of you, boy.
It's fun.
Right? Right?
So when the bylaw establishes authority to charge a fee, you still have to go through the process of rate setting, and that has to be voted upon. There's a public process for that, which is why the public engagement component up here shows the full duration of the project. So even if it's not a forum like this, it would be, a select board meeting, finance committee meeting. Just because you implement the bylaw doesn't mean you finalize it. I've seen bylaws sit on the books. I hate to say that, but it happens. Things get tabled. Final rate setting takes longer. Like Chris said, it could take 2 years. If we really want to, if we really feel we need to spend the time to do so, we do that.
Getting it on the table.
Huh?
This is just getting it on the table.
Correct. We're agreeing that this makes sense to pursue the concept and to establish the ability to create the account and build the program. But we can't send out bills. We don't have any of those things legally in place. And so that's a process to implement. It's not as elaborate as it sounds. I've seen it happen very quick and very simply. But it does take time. And this is our kind of first pass at what we think it would look like for implementation.
Well, if my research proved correctly too, this was actually an amendment to the Water Protection Act, where during the Trump administration, they added this, you could do a financial thing. My words are not coming too quickly. Fill in my blanks. But that it was actually set up that this was given to towns to be able to control the groundwater.
Yeah, so Mass General Law, Chapter 83, Section 6, is the enabling legislation that allows you at the state level, because it's home rule state, so you as long as you're conforming with enabling legislation at the state level, it allows you to implement a fee. So that's referenced in the bylaw, if you want to look that up. It's a couple paragraphs. It's pretty brief, and it does speak to things like, equitable, it's a fee for service, it's not arbitrary, it's not a tax thing, right? And so it's similar to water and sewer. But what happened at the federal level may have, through what we call Clean Water Act and things like that, There are some initiatives that, at the federal level that have occurred over time, but this has been in place in Massachusetts for over a decade, at least. I'd have to see when it was first created, but that's been in place. But that is a legal component to allow the town to implement this. So, which is why a bylaw is necessary to establish local authority.
Just to give a quick example, we just recently finished up a water main replacement project. It was about 1 mile, cost a little over $1 million. So we're currently working on the replacement of one culvert in town that's going to have an estimated construction cost of $900,000. And it's only roughly 40 lineal feet. So 40 lineal feet into over 5,000 lineal feet of water main replacement projects. So not all utilities underground relate to the same cost. And certainly drainage can be extremely expensive and complicated to get through the permitting process. So just as a recent example, in the last year. And getting back to some of the comments, 2008, I believe, was when the initial stormwater bylaw was passed at town meeting, and that was a regulatory mandate. It's being updated now. That required a certain amount of rooftop recharge predominantly on newer construction. So if you're watching this and you say, hey, I built that garage and I had a rooftop, that could be a applied credit. Or if you're a residential and you're running a business out of your home and you had to go through site plan approval, you may also have some other best management stormwater practice on your property, so think about those things. But just because your driveway pitches away from the public right of way and does not contribute stormwater, that's not a credit because you're still using all the infrastructure on the road to get to your home. So we still as a community need to fund our own infrastructure so that we're a viable community. There's a ton of infrastructure in this town, and it really wasn't until the last couple months that we, the DPW, actually have a handle on the total assets throughout the town. It's astronomical how much we have for water, sewer, and drainage. Most of which, not most, some of which you don't even know. It's cross-country through the woods. Difficult to get to. So.
Any other questions? So we'll do this again tonight. It's the same, I mean, you're welcome to come back, but it's the same process. And then we do have plenty of things on the website, and there's probably going to be more information we'll put out as we get it over the next several weeks. And then obviously town meeting is at the end of March, and look forward to, discussion there as well. So thanks for coming today.
Thank you.